wasn't an airplane. It was not an airplane. It was down awfully low.
You are listening to Pursuit of the Paranormal podcast with your host, Ash Ellis.
Yes, welcome back to Pursuit of the Paranormal. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, all them different abduction stories, and I hope you did because we're back for more. Another 4 or 5 abduction stories. Some of them I hope you've not heard before, so hopefully it's new accounts of alien abduction that you can enjoy and listen to. And there's one in here that you probably definitely will have heard of. It became a motion picture. It's been well written about, so we'll throw that into the middle. But yeah, hopefully the other ones are pretty new to you. So yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if you've heard these stories before. Let me know if you're enjoying these abduction tales. So, cracking on. We're going to start over back in America, carrying on from last week. There's a couple there from the States. And this time I'm going to be talking about the account of the Reed family, whose strange encounter in Sheffield, Massachusetts during the 1960s actually did become one of the most famous UFO abduction cases. But let's find out why. So, we're going back to 1954. A strange night at a cabin by Moosehead Lake. Nancy Reed was just 15 years old, spending the night at the cabin with her mother, brother and his girlfriend. In the dead of the night, she and her brother's girlfriend were jolted awake by a blinding light that filled the room. Suddenly, 2 small, tubby figures stood silently in the corner, watching them. Nancy couldn't move, not on her own at least. She felt as though something else was moving her legs for her, while she remained completely paralysed. As the night dragged on and daylight began to creep in, the paralysis slowly faded, but both girls were left feeling incredibly nauseous. This bizarre and terrifying incident would haunt Nancy for years, but it wouldn't be her last brush with the unexplained. Over a decade later, the strange visitations would return, only this time they focused on her 2 sons, Thomas and Matthew Reed. It all started, innocently enough, between 1966 and 1969. Thomas and Matthew began noticing strange orbs in their bedrooms at night. These bright orbs floated around, almost as if they were watching them. Then, just as mysteriously as they appeared, they would vanish into thin air. But that was only the beginning. One night, the boys recall standing at the top of the stairs when they were suddenly lifted out of their home, right through the roof, and into a strange ship that they said looked like a turtle. Inside, they were escorted by 2 figures, and Thomas remembers being shown an image of a willow tree. He was told that this tree held great importance. Both boys were also shown pictures of galaxy clusters, and then they heard something chilling. They were being used as part of a study on human genetics and the immune system. After that, they woke up back in their bedrooms with no idea how much time had passed. These kinds of encounters weren't a one-time event. The boys were abducted multiple times over the next few years. In one particularly frightening instance, Nancy woke up to find both her sons missing from their rooms. When she finally found them on a trail near their ranch, they were both covered in mud, about 15 feet apart, and in a catatonic state. When they came to, the boys told their mother that a ball of light had taken them. Even more disturbingly, they said they had seen beings standing over Nancy and their grandmother while they slept, as if observing them. Then came the night of September 1st, 1969, a night that would not only change the Reeds family's lives forever, but also impact the entire town of Sheffield, Massachusetts. That evening, Nancy, her 2 boys and their grandmother were driving across a covered bridge when they all saw a bright light rising from the river. Nancy's heart sank. She knew what was about to happen and tried to outrun the light, but the car stalled leaving them helpless. The next thing they knew, they were no longer in the car. Instead, they found themselves inside a huge structure that resembled an aircraft hangar. Thomas later described the inside as being filled with strange lights, almost like fluorescent tubes. And then, just as suddenly, they were back in the car. But something was off. Nancy was sitting in a different seat than when they started the journey, and the air around them was eerily silent. No sounds of birds, no insects, nothing. After a few moments, the world around them seemed to return to normal. But 2 hours had passed, and yet it only felt like minutes. Here is where it gets even more interesting. The Reeds weren't the only ones to experience something strange that night. Local radio stations were flooded with calls from more than 40 people, all reporting UFO sightings and strange lights in the sky. One witness, who was lying in his backyard stargazing, described seeing an enormous craft that beamed light down towards him, with colours he had never seen before. His account, like so many others, remains vivid to this day, and he's certain that what he saw was an alien spacecraft. Despite the overwhelming number of witnesses, the Reed family's story was met with skepticism. Thomas even took a polygraph test, which he passed with flying colours, but it did little to silence the doubters. The ridicule took a heavy toll on the family. They were bullied, they were mocked. People would come into Nancy's restaurant just to laugh. The harassment became so intense that they eventually had to board up their home and move away. Fast forward to 2009. Matthew Reed was driving home after dropping off a friend when, at a red light, he suddenly found himself parked near a cornfield. An hour had passed and he had no memory of how he got there. His boots were covered in mud and he recalled seeing a ship in the sky. Investigators from UFON later found strange magnetic anomalies around his car, with compasses spinning wildly and radiation readings spiking. But when they tested areas further from the car, everything was normal. The Reed family story has been featured on countless TV shows and documentaries, including The X-Files. However, the family feels that many of these portrayals have sensationalized their experience, distorting the truth of what really happened. But here's something remarkable. In 2015, the Great Barrington Historical Society Museum recognised the Reed family's case as a legitimate historical event, the first UFO experience ever recorded as fact in the US. That same year, Thomas Reed placed a memorial at the site of the bridge incident, bearing a citation from the Massachusetts governor acknowledging the off-world incident of September the 1st, 1969. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated the recognition. The monument was vandalised and later removed in 2019, supposedly for not having the right permits. But the Reed family continues to speak out, determined to share their story. It's hard to ignore the fact that over 40 people witnessed something strange that night in 1969. Could all of them be mistaken? Or was something truly extraordinary happening in the skies over Sheffield, Massachusetts? A trip to the other side of the world now, as we head to Gundaya, a small, quiet village nestled in Queensland, Australia. A place where people live simple lives, far removed from the extraordinary, or so they thought. It's October the 4th, 2001. On this particular night, 3 people, namely Amy Rylance, her husband Keith, and their business partner Petra Heller, are staying at their estate, which they're currently renovating into a winery. Due to ongoing construction, caravans have been set up as a temporary lodging across the site. As night falls, the wind picks up and a storm brews outside. The group settles in, unaware that something unthinkable is about to unfold. It's around 9:30 p.m. Keith has already fallen asleep in the bedroom, and Petra, sleeping in the annex, drifts off as well. Meanwhile, Amy's in the lounge, relaxing on the sofa, slowly being lulled to sleep by the storm. But by 11:15 at night, everything changes. Petra wakes suddenly and walks into the lounge, only to be met by a sight straight out of a sci-fi movie. Amy, the woman who'd been peacefully sleeping just moments before, is now floating, suspended in mid-air. A beam of light shines through the window, enveloping her and several objects from a nearby coffee table. The light, Petra realises, is coming from a disc-shaped object hovering outside the house, just against the tree line. Then, in an instant, everything goes black for Petra. She collapses. What happens next is both chilling and confusing. Keith, awoken by Petra's scream, rushes into the lounge. He finds her lying on the floor, disoriented. She struggles to make sense of what she had just seen, stammering as she tries to explain. Keith looks around in a panic. Amy is nowhere to be found. He then notices something outside. The window covering has been torn, and there are strange marks on the bush, as if something had scorched it with extreme heat. Frantically, he calls out for Amy, but she's simply gone. At 11:40, Keith then calls the local police. 3 officers arrive and begin searching the property, but there's no sign of Amy anywhere. Although skeptical of the story, the police take forensic samples from the torn window and note the unusual heat damage to the bush below. There's no rational explanation. But then, just as the investigation begins to ramp up, Keith receives a phone call that defies all logic. A woman, 500 miles away, has found Amy. The caller explains she found Amy, disoriented and confused, at a petrol station in the town of Mackay. She had taken her to the hospital, where Amy was safe but clearly shaken. In disbelief, Keith hands the phone to the police officer. What happened to Amy? How did she end up 500 miles away in the span of a few hours? When Amy was interviewed, her memories were fragmented. She recalled lying on the couch just as she had been, but the next thing she remembered was waking up in a strange, unfamiliar room. Light seeped through the walls and ceiling, and she heard a male voice speaking softly, trying to reassure her. Then, through a door in the wall, a tall, slender figure entered the room. He was about 6 foot tall, dressed in a full bodysuit, and his face was partially covered by a mask, though his eyes, nose, and mouth were visible. Amy was told she'd be returned soon, not far from where she was taken. But before she could process any of this, she fell asleep again. The next thing she knew, she woke up on the ground, surrounded by trees. Disoriented, she wandered through the bushland for what felt like hours, until she stumbled upon the petrol station, where she was eventually found. At the hospital, Amy's account was formally recorded by the police. Despite their warnings about making false statements, Amy stuck to her story, recalling vivid details of the strange events. Even more perplexing were the physical changes in Amy's body. She had noticeable hair growth, despite the fact that just hours earlier she had dyed her hair. Marks were also found on her inner thigh and heels, small, triangular imprints that could not be easily explained. Keith and Petra, still reeling from the experience, began to seek answers. They purchased a magazine on UFOs and reluctantly reached out to the Australian UFO Research Network, who quickly took a keen interest in the case. Investigators Diane Harrison and Bill Chalker were assigned to look into it. The investigation began on October the 9th at the Gundaya residence, but physical evidence was hard to come by. The torn window could have been caused by the dog, which had been jumping up at it, according to a neighbour, and the heat damage to the bush, a common occurrence from direct sunlight, said the gardener. Yet, the police remained cooperative, and Amy's story stayed consistent, despite the mounting criticism. Investigators found it difficult to interview the witnesses. Keith and Amy had moved from motel to motel, dodging the press, and even claimed to have been followed by mysterious men in black figures, leading to a frightening car chase at one point. In the end, no physical evidence ever definitively proved what had happened that night, and to this day, no one's been able to offer a rational explanation for how Amy Rylance disappeared from her home and reappeared 500 miles away. Was it a hoax, an hallucination, or something beyond our comprehension? On November 5th, 1975, one of the most well-known and controversial UFO abduction cases in history took place. A case that has inspired books, documentaries, and a $20 million Hollywood movie. This is the story of Travis Walton, a tale of extraterrestrial encounters that has captivated believers and skeptics alike for nearly 5 decades. The events of that day unfolded in the Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona, USA. Travis Walton, just 22 years old at the time, was working with a group of forestry contractors, cutting down trees in the dense, isolated woods. As they wrapped up a long, exhausting day, the crew piled into their truck and headed home. But on the way, something unusual caught their attention. Just off the road, through the thick forest, they spotted a bright, glowing object hovering above the ground. It was saucer-shaped, metallic, and emitting strange mechanical sounds. Intrigued, they brought their truck to a stop for a closer look. Travis, unlike the others, felt drawn to the mysterious craft. Against the desperate pleas of his crew, he stepped out of the truck and approached the object. What happened next would change his life forever. Without warning, a brilliant blue-green beam of light shot from the object, striking Travis and throwing him at least 20 feet through the air. His colleagues watched in horror as his body crumpled to the ground, motionless. Panic took hold. Convinced that their friend was either dead or gravely injured, the men did what most of us probably wouldn't want to admit they'd do. They fled. They sped away, terrified for their own lives. But guilt gnawed at them, and minutes later they turned back to check on Travis. But when they returned to the spot, Travis was gone. What followed was a frantic search and a mystery that would unravel over the course of 5 days. The men reported the incident to the local authorities, but understandably, the story of a UFO abduction was met with suspicion. Deputy Chuck Ellison was the first to respond to the crew's call, and, although sceptical, he later admitted that the men seemed genuinely shaken. If they were acting, Ellison said, they were awfully good at it. Law enforcement searched the area but found no trace of Travis Walton. The more time passed, the more it began to look like a missing person case, perhaps even a murder investigation. Some believed the men had concocted the UFO story as a cover-up of Travis's death. To prove their innocence, the entire crew agreed to take polygraph tests. 6 of the men passed, but 1 test came back inconclusive. Even with this result, doubts lingered, and the story captured the attention of local media and UFO enthusiasts. But then, 5 days after his disappearance, Travis Walton re-emerged, alive. In the early hours of November 11th, Travis's sister-in-law received a call. It was Travis, disoriented, calling from a phone booth at a gas station about 30 miles from where he'd vanished. His family rushed to find him, and soon after, they took him to the hospital for a full examination. Travis was malnourished, unshaven and confused, but physically unharmed. What was most shocking, however, was the story he told. He remembered being struck by the beam of light, and the next thing he knew, he was on a cold metal table, surrounded by strange alien beings. They were about 5 feet tall, with large heads and massive dark eyes. Their orange suits stood out in the cold, sterile room, and as the reality of his situation sank in, Travis panicked. He managed to leap off the table and grab a glass-like tube in an attempt to defend himself. But the beings didn't seem aggressive. In fact, they simply left the room. Wandering the strange facility, Travis encountered more unusual beings, including a tall, humanoid figure in a blue suit with a glass-like helmet. This figure led into a larger hangar-like area where he noticed other craft, similar to the one he had seen in the forest. His last memory was of being approached by another humanoid with large eyes, and then everything went black. The next thing he knew, he was waking up on the side of the road, watching a metallic disc-shaped object shoot off into the sky at an impossible speed. As you can imagine, the story of Travis's abduction sent shockwaves through both the local community and the broader public. Over the years, countless theories have emerged. Some suggest that Travis and his crew concocted the whole thing to avoid penalties for missing a work deadline. Others point to his lifelong interest in UFOs, suggesting it was all an elaborate hoax for financial gain or fame. But what's compelling is that Travis Walton has never wavered from his story, even after all of these years. He's taken multiple polygraph tests, some decades apart, and he continues to pass. His account of that fateful night and the days that followed remains consistent, despite the skepticism and the criticism that he's faced. And then there are those who believe. The events of that November night in 1975 remain one of the most documented UFO abduction cases in history. It's a story that continues to intrigue, baffle, and inspire. Was Travis Walton truly abducted by extraterrestrial beings? Or was it an elaborate ruse that stood the test of time? We may never have definitive answers, but the mystery of what happened to Travis deep in the woods of Arizona will live on, fueling the imagination of UFO enthusiasts and skeptics alike. In 1896, the terms alien, UFO, or extraterrestrial were far from commonplace. But that year, an article was published in the Stockton Evening Standard in California that would change how people thought about what or who could be out there. It was November 25th, 1896. Colonel H.G. Shaw and his companion were travelling by horse and carriage on the way to Stockton. The ride was uneventful until something startled the horses. When Shaw looked out of the carriage to investigate, he was shocked to see 3 tall, humanoid figures standing by the side of the road. These beings were unlike anything that Shaw had ever seen. They stood about 7 feet tall, their bodies covered in a soft brown down. They were bald, with long spindly arms that ended in small hands. Their eyes were large, far bigger than their mouths, giving them a strange yet oddly beautiful appearance, as Shaw would later describe. It was getting dark, but each of these beings carried small lamps that emitted an unnatural brightness. They also had bags slung over their shoulders and what appeared to be breathing devices, which they would periodically suck on. As the light from their lamps cut through the twilight, Shaw and his companion could make out what seemed to be a craft hovering in the sky above them. The beings didn't communicate in any recognisable language or through telepathy, but instead used a bizarre chanting sound. According to Shaw, they attempted to abduct him and his companion, but ultimately they were unable to lift them due to their mass. Rather than running in fear, Shaw and his companion, fueled by curiosity, followed the beings towards a nearby bridge, where a cigar-shaped craft hovered just above. They watched as the beings moved, not by walking, but by what Shaw described as gliding. When they reached the craft, the beings performed a sort of springing leap, effortlessly propelling themselves up and into the vessel. The craft then vanished into the sky, leaving Shaw and his companion bewildered. At the time, many people speculated that the beings were visitors from Mars. The idea of aircraft, especially one that could hover or fly, seemed implausible. After all, the first successful powered flight wouldn't happen until 1903. The only flying machines around then were hot air balloons, the first of which had taken flight in 1793. Even the famed Zeppelin airships didn't enter the skies until the early 1900s. Looking back at the illustrations made in 1896 of the craft, The resemblance to later airships like the Zeppelin is uncanny, particularly in the shape and the small propellers. Could this sighting have been an early unrecorded attempt at human flight? Or was it something beyond our understanding? There's no physical evidence to corroborate Shaw's story. No forensic investigation was conducted, and we're left only with the accounts of Shaw and his companion. Yet, this wasn't the only sighting during that period. In fact, throughout 1896, there were hundreds of reports of strange objects in the sky, many witnessed by multiple people. Could they all be explained by experimental airships? Or were some truly otherworldly? Of course, skepticism is natural. Some have pointed out that Shaw had come from a tavern before the alleged encounter, raising questions about whether alcohol might have played a role in the tale. But even if we entertain that possibility, it's hard to dismiss the sheer volume of similar sightings across the country. Whether you believe Colonel Shaw's story or think it was simply the product of a foggy memory or imagination, this account remains one of the earliest and most intriguing UFO encounters on record. And if it's true, then perhaps ET visitors and abduction have been with us for far longer than we realise. Flitting back into between Australia and America now, we are back down under, and this is the Peter Cowrie case. Not totally sure on the pronunciation of the surname, but I'm going to stick with Cowrie, even though it doesn't even sound right saying it. But anyway, so Peter Cowrie was born in Lebanon in 1964 and moved to Australia with his family in 1973. Like many people who've experienced something unexplainable, Peter's story starts relatively innocently. His first encounter with a UFO happened in February of 1988 while he was with his wife. They simply observed an unusual object in the sky, nothing dramatic, just enough to spark some curiosity. However, later that same year, Peter's life took a much stranger turn. One night, as Peter lay in bed, he felt something grab his ankles. He was fully conscious but completely paralysed, unable to move. As he lay there, he saw 4 small, hooded beings standing by his bed. They communicated telepathically, telling him that everything would be okay and that it would be like the last time. A large needle appeared and moved towards his head, and then nothing. Peter blacked out. When he woke up, startled and confused, he realised that over an hour had passed. What made things even stranger, his wife noticed dry blood on his temple near a small puncture mark, further deepening the mystery. In the months that followed, Peter struggled to make sense of what happened. That is, until he read Communion, a book by Whitley Strieber, which described eerily similar experiences. It was then that Peter realised he might not be alone in what he was going through. But things get stranger. Fast forward now to July 23rd, 1992. Peter was at home, resting his injured leg in bed. It was around 7:30 in the morning when he suddenly woke up to find 2 humanoid figures sitting on his bed. They were both naked, but something about them wasn't quite human. One was a tall blonde woman with curly hair down her back and piercing blue eyes. The other appeared to be of Asian descent, with dark hair and deep, dark eyes. The faces were unusual, slightly elongated with high cheekbones, and they seemed to be communicating telepathically. What happens next is shocking. The blonde woman moved closer to Peter, forcibly pulling his head to her chest. Peter bit her nipple, but oddly she didn't seem to feel any pain. A small piece of tissue lodged in his mouth, causing him to cough, and just like that, both beings vanished. Peter, confused and unsettled, went to the bathroom. What he found was even more perplexing. His penis was sore, and when he pulled back his foreskin, he found 2 long, blonde hairs wrapped tightly around it. He struggled to remove them, feeling a burning sensation as he did so. but he managed to collect the hairs and place them in a plastic bag, with Peter later reflecting, saying, "There's no way those hairs should have been there. Something bizarre had clearly happened." But the story doesn't stop there. In 1996, Peter decided to undergo regression therapy with Harvard psychiatrist John Mack. Unfortunately, the sessions didn't reveal much more than a few fragmented memories, mostly of being on a table in a brightly lit room. What's compelling here is that Peter was reluctant to share his story, which to some lends credibility to his claims. He wasn't out seeking fame or attention. Now let's get onto the science. So there were 2 blonde hairs Peter collected, which were analysed by the Anomaly Physical Evidence Group using polymerase chain reaction testing, PCR testing, the standard method for DNA analysis. The results: the hair was indeed human, but with some very unusual characteristics. It wasn't from someone who's Caucasian, as you might expect from a blonde hair. Instead, the DNA showed markers belonging to a rare genetic group, typically found in Chinese Mongoloid populations. Even stranger, this specific genetic marker had only been recorded in 4 other individuals worldwide, all of them Chinese, and all with black hair. So how does a blonde hair show up with such a rare genetic profile? That's the big question. And there's more. The hair's root and strand show 2 different DNA results, a phenomenon that's difficult to explain. And perhaps most intriguingly, the DNA contained a rare marker that makes individuals resistant to diseases like HIV and smallpox. Could this indicate genetic manipulation? Maybe even cloning? Some theorists believe so. Others suggest it could point to time-travelling humans, or even ET hybrids. Despite the bizarre nature of this case, Peter Khoury's story didn't end in 1992. In 1996, he had another encounter where he claims to have seen small hooded beings passing through a mirror in his bedroom, levitating him off the bed. His experiences raise as many questions as the answer. So, there's plenty of skeptics with this case. For example, why wasn't the DNA research published and peer-reviewed? Why would Pete have the presence of mind to collect the hairs after such a traumatic event? And what about the hair sample? Where and how was it stored before it was tested? Could improper storage have affected the results? These are valid questions and unanswered questions. But the story is fascinating and perplexing, even now, decades later. Whether you believe it or not, it's hard to deny that this case, with its strange mix of DNA evidence, telepathic beings and mysterious encounters, is one of the most extraordinary alien abduction stories ever told. To finish off, we're going to have another international jaunt, this time to Europe and Italy. And we all know that feeling, counting down the seconds until our lunch break at work, even if we just grab a quick bite at our desks. It's that moment to pause and refuel. But what if your lunch break took you somewhere far, far away? Somewhere you never expected? Not just out of the office, but far beyond Earth itself. That's exactly what happened to Luciano Galli back in 1957. It started as a typical day in Rome. Galli was heading back to work after stepping out for lunch, just like many of us would. But what happened next? Well, it was anything but ordinary. As Galli walked down the street, he noticed a car pull up beside him, a classic Fiat 1100. Nothing strange about that. But then the window rolled down, and inside was a man with jet black eyes staring at him. The man spoke perfect Italian, asking Galli a question that froze him in his tracks. "Do you remember me?" Now, Galli was confused. He didn't recognise the man, at least not at first, but before he could even respond, a flood of memories came rushing back. Memories that had somehow been buried. Garley remembered meeting this mysterious man before, right here on the streets of Rome. It all felt so familiar, yet so unreal. And then, without thinking, without questioning, Garley got into the car. They drove to the outskirts of Rome, and that's where things took a truly otherworldly turn. Together, they boarded a large saucer-shaped UFO that was waiting for them. According to Garley, the craft had an opening at the bottom, like a hatch that allowed them to step inside. As they entered, there was a flash, a photograph, the man told him, for identification purposes. Bit of a strange security check. Inside the UFO, Garley was taken to what he called a base, where an enormous mothership was waiting. He was shown around this strange place by the dark-eyed man, and Garley remembers seeing around 500 people, humans or something like humans, moving in and out of the smaller crafts. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Garley found himself back on the pavement outside his workplace, as if no time had passed at all. It was like waking up from a dream, except he was sure it wasn't a dream. This had happened. Now, this wasn't the end of the story. In 1962, a few years after his strange encounter, Garley shared his experience with a journalist. The journalist had been assigned to cover the numerous UFO sightings that had been reported around Rome in the late 1950s and early 60s, including this encounter. During the interview, Garley confirmed something incredible. He had been told that the ships came from a base near Venus. The journalist wasn't exactly thrilled to be covering such an outlandish story, but Garley stood firm. He insisted his lunch hour abduction was 100% real, and he provided even more details. He remembered that the man with the dark eyes who picked him up that day, he was dressed sharply, in a double-buttoned suit, complete with a collar and tie, and a well-groomed moustache. The man driving the car, he never spoke. He just wore a strange, light-coloured outfit. Garley said that despite the initial fear, because who wouldn't be terrified getting into a car with a stranger, he eventually felt a sense of calm, especially once they reached the UFO. He was still wearing his work overalls, but everyone on the ship, men and women alike, were dressed in silky, shiny suits, and they weren't hostile. In fact, he described them as exceptionally friendly. The whole experience lasted just over 3 hours. But Garley was never put under hypnosis. He never underwent regression therapy to cover his memories. He always stood by his story, saying it happened exactly as he remembered. So that is it for this alien abduction couple of special episodes. I really hope you enjoyed those accounts. Some terrifying, some intriguing, and certainly very, very interesting. Hard to believe, hard what not to believe. Some really strange encounters there, let's say. Thanks for listening again. And next week we have a very interesting interview. I'm looking forward to this one. So make sure you check that out in a week and hit all those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you very much, and until next time, keep looking and stay weird.
Thanks for listening to Pursuit of the Paranormal with Ash Ellis. Title music created by Steve Yarwood and Ambienfinity. If you like the show, please follow us on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, X, and Instagram. And if you really like the show, please rate and review the show wherever you are listening. It really does help. See you next time, and until then, stay weird.